Leonardo da Vinci left fewer than 20 finished paintings. He left thousands of pages of notebooks, filled with mirror-script observations, anatomical drawings, engineering designs, water studies, geological notes, musical theories, and architectural plans, the majority of which were never acted upon, never published, and not fully understood until centuries after his death. He is described, in almost every account written about him, as a man of limitless curiosity and catastrophic incompleteness, someone who could begin anything and rarely finish it, whose mind moved so fast that the act of execution always lagged behind the act of conception. And yet the things he did finish changed the history of art, science, and engineering in ways that no other single person has equaled. The question of Leonardo da Vinci. The question that has been asked about him since his own lifetime, is not what he achieved, but what he was. Whether the answer is genius, or something stranger and harder to name, depends on how closely you look at the notebooks. Tuscany and the illegitimate advantage. Leonardo was born on April 15, 1452, in the small Tuscan town of Vinci, the illegitimate son of a notary named Piero da Vinci and a peasant woman named Caterina. The circumstances of his birth, which his father's family considered shameful and which Leonardo himself apparently never forgot, turned out to be one of the formative conditions of his genius. Because he was illegitimate, the doors of conventional professional life, law, medicine, the church, public administration, were largely closed to him. The educational path of the educated professional class, with its years of Latin texts and Aristotelian authority, was not available to him either. Instead, he grew up partly outdoors, in the Tuscan landscape, watching. He watched birds in flight, paying attention to the relationship between wing shape and angle of attack. He watched water moving around obstacles in streams, noting the patterns of vortices and eddies. He watched light change through the day, mapping the way shadows moved and softened. This was not a romantic childhood in nature. It was systematic, obsessive observation of the physical world by a boy who had no other curriculum. The education he received was the education of someone who could not afford to trust authority and had to figure things out from scratch. At around 14, his father recognized his son's unusual talent for drawing and placed him in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the finest artists in Florence, and crucially, not only a painter but a sculptor, goldsmith, metallurgist, and engineer. The workshop was a laboratory as much as an atelier, and in it Leonardo learned to think about art and science as aspects of the same inquiry rather than separate disciplines. There is a story, reported by Giorgio Vasari decades after the fact, that Verrocchio assigned the young Leonardo an angel in his painting of the baptism of Christ, and that the angel Leonardo produced was so demonstrably superior to the master's own figures that Verrocchio put down his brushes and never painted again. The story is probably embellished. What is documented is that Verrocchio continued to use Leonardo's skills and that Leonardo remained in the workshop for years, long past the usual period of apprenticeship, suggesting that whatever was developing there was not a simple teacher-student relationship. Seeing as a science, Sfumato and the anatomy of light. Leonardo's central artistic conviction was that painting was not a craft or a decoration, it was the highest form of knowledge, superior even to literature, because it could capture the visible world with an immediacy and completeness that words could never achieve. The eye, he wrote, is the window of the soul. And the eye, properly trained and properly used, could see things that no other instrument could measure. The technique he developed to match this ambition was sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke or vapor. Earlier Renaissance painters had defined their figures with clear outlines, which created a kind of visual authority but also a flatness. Outlined objects looked like drawings of things rather than things themselves. Leonardo noticed that in the actual world, no object has a sharp outline. The air between the viewer and the object has density, it scatters light, it softens edges in proportion to distance. A face seen across a room has no definite boundary between the face and the air around it. To reproduce this, he built up his paintings in layers of glaze so thin they were essentially transparent, each layer modifying the ones beneath in ways that the eye could register but the mind could not articulate. The result was that his figures seemed to exist in actual space rather than on a flat surface, and that their expressions became genuinely ambiguous, because the subtle shifts of tone at the corners of the mouth and eyes that define a human expression were rendered without the clarity that would pin them down. This is why the Mona Lisa's smile cannot be described with certainty. It is not a fixed expression. It is a gradient, and what the gradient means shifts depending on where you direct your attention. The bodies he opened. Leonardo's conviction that the painter had to understand the body from the inside drove him to anatomy. He dissected human corpses, more than 30 of them over the course of his life, by his own account. At a time when this required not only institutional permission, which was difficult to obtain, but also a tolerance for conditions that even by the standards of the era were extreme. He worked in cold rooms by candlelight on bodies in various states of decomposition, drawing what he saw with a precision that was not surpassed until the invention of photography. His anatomical drawings of the skull, the spine, the musculature of the shoulder, the valves of the heart, the structure of the eye, the development of the fetus in the uterus, are still reproduced in medical textbooks not as historical curiosities but as accurate representations. His understanding of how the heart worked was, in key respects, ahead of the scientific consensus by more than a century. He identified the function of the aortic valve and described the turbulent flow of blood through it in terms that modern cardiologists recognize as essentially correct, more than 400 years before they had the instruments to confirm it. He also did something with anatomy that no one before him had attempted. He used it as the foundation for a theory of artistic proportion. The Vitruvian Man. The drawing of a male figure inscribed simultaneously in a circle and a square, arms and legs extended to two positions, is not primarily an artistic image. It is a mathematical argument about the relationship between human bodily proportions and the geometric forms that underlie the universe. Leonardo was making the claim, inherited from the Roman architect Vitruvius and extended by his own measurements, that the human body embodies the same mathematical relationships that govern architecture, music, and the natural world. Beauty, in this framework, is not subjective. It is a property of correctly perceived proportion. The Notebooks, a mind thinking out loud. The notebooks Leonardo left behind. Roughly 7,200 pages survive out of an estimated original total perhaps 3 times that size, are unlike any other document in the history of human thought. They are not organized by subject, not edited for an audience, not arranged to make an argument. They are the working record of a single mind moving through problems in the order they presented themselves, which means that on a single page you might find a study of water vortices, a sketch of a machine for raising columns, a note about the preparation of a new pigment, a geometric proof, and a shopping list. They were written in mirror script, from right to left, readable only when reflected, in Leonardo's left hand. The usual explanation is practical. He was left-handed, and writing in the conventional direction caused his hand to drag through fresh ink. But the mirror script also had the effect of making the notebooks inaccessible to casual readers, which may not have been entirely unintentional in an era when the Church's relationship to scientific speculation was not always comfortable. The Codex Atlanticus, now in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan, is the largest. Nearly 1,200 pages covering 40 years of work across virtually every subject Leonardo studied. The Codex Leicester, purchased by Bill Gates in 1994 for $30 million and still privately owned, contains Leonardo's most sustained scientific investigation, 72 pages of closely argued analysis of water, its movement, its erosive action on rock, the reasons for the presence of marine fossils in mountain strata, and the implications for the age of the Earth. Conclusions that prefigured geological science by more than 2 centuries. The notebook that Gates bought for $30 million contains, among other things, Leonardo's argument that the Earth is far older than the Bible suggests, an argument he was careful not to publish. Machines that were too early. The engineering designs in the notebooks are the most famous and most frequently misunderstood aspect of Leonardo's legacy. They are often presented as proof that he invented the helicopter, the tank, the parachute, and the robot, and in a literal sense, he drew workable versions of all of these things. But the more interesting story is not the inventory of inventions but the question of why none of them were built. The flying machine designs, the ornithopter, which mimicked bird flight with flapping wings driven by human muscle power. The aerial screw, which anticipated the helicopter's principle of generating lift through a rotating helical surface, were based on correct aerodynamic observations but wrong assumptions about available power. A human being cannot generate enough sustained muscular output to lift a human-scale aircraft with flapping wings. The physics was right, the energy source was wrong. The machines could not have flown in the 15th century, and Leonardo probably knew this. He was designing for a future in which the energy problem might be solved, which it eventually was, by the internal combustion engine. The armored vehicle, a circular, dome-shaped structure that could move in any direction, bristling with cannons, powered by men turning cranks inside, has a famous defect: the gearing is drawn in a configuration that would cause the front and rear wheels to turn in opposite directions, making the vehicle immobile. This has been interpreted either as a design error or as a deliberate sabotage, Leonardo inserting a fatal flaw to prevent the weapon from being built. Whether or not that is true, the image of him designing weapons while privately wishing they would not work is consistent with everything we know about the contradictions of his character. The parachute design, a pyramidal cloth canopy, was built and tested in the early 21st century by the British skydiver Adrian Nicholas, who jumped from a hot air balloon with a parachute constructed exactly to Leonardo's specifications and landed safely. It worked. It had been sitting in a notebook for 500 years, fully functional and completely ignored. The Last Supper, a room full of decisions. The Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 1498 on the wall of the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan, is the most studied single composition in the history of painting, and also one of the most damaged, because of a technical decision Leonardo made that he had to have known was risky. Traditional fresco technique required the painter to work rapidly into wet plaster, section by section, with no possibility of revision. Leonardo, whose entire method depended on endless revision, who would make a single brushstroke, step back, look for an hour, and make another, found this intolerable. He painted on dry plaster with an experimental mixture of oil and tempera that allowed him to rework passages indefinitely. The surface began to deteriorate within decades. By the time Vasari saw it in the 1560s, the figures were already badly damaged. It has been restored multiple times, most recently in a 20-year project completed in 1999. What we see today is a heavily reconstructed version of what Leonardo painted, but the composition he designed is intact. The moment he chose to depict was the instant after Christ says, "One of you will betray me." The 12 apostles are shown in 4 groups of 3, each group reacting differently, with shock, denial, anger, grief, calculation. Leonardo spent years finding the right faces. He searched the streets of Milan for models whose expressions matched what he needed, reportedly telling the prior of the monastery who complained about his slowness that he was still looking for a face capable of carrying the guilt of Judas. The perspective of the room is constructed so that all its orthogonal lines converge on Christ's head. A compositional decision so subtle that most viewers do not consciously notice it and so precise that it required the kind of geometric calculation that Leonardo performed as naturally as breathing. The Mona Lisa, what the smile actually is. The Mona Lisa was almost certainly begun around 1503 as a commission from Francesco del Giocondo, a Florentine silk merchant, for a portrait of his wife Lisa Gherardini. It was supposed to be a conventional portrait of a merchant's wife. A record of status and respectability. What Leonardo made of it was something else entirely, and he apparently recognized this, because he kept the painting and continued working on it for the rest of his life, carrying it to France when he moved there in 1516 and never delivering it to the man who had commissioned it. The Sfumato technique reaches its most sophisticated application in the Mona Lisa's face. The corners of her mouth and the corners of her eyes. The two areas of the face that carry the most expressive information in a human expression, are deliberately left in the zone of maximum ambiguity. There are no sharp transitions, no clear lines. The tone shifts so gradually that the eye cannot pin down what the expression is doing. When you look directly at her mouth, you see something close to a neutral expression. When you look at her eyes, peripheral vision processes her mouth differently, and the smile appears. When you look back at her mouth directly, it recedes again. The painting is not a fixed image. It is a perceptual event that changes every time you look at it. The landscape behind her, turbulent, geological, with winding rivers and eroded rock formations, is not a background. It is a statement about the relationship between the human figure and the natural world. The rocks behind her are the same rocks he was analyzing in the Codex Leicester. Ancient, eroded by water over immense time, evidence of an earth far older than anyone then acknowledged. The woman and the landscape are the same kind of thing, both products of the same natural laws, both subject to the same forces, both studied by the same eye. Amboise, the last conversation. In 1516, at the age of 64, Leonardo accepted an invitation from Francis I of France. A young king who was, in the manner of Renaissance monarchs competing for cultural prestige, intensely eager to have the most famous artist in the world at his court. Leonardo was given the Château du Clos-Luce, near the royal residence at Amboise, a generous annual stipend, and the titles of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king. He was told he was free to pursue whatever interested him. Francis I, by several accounts, simply wanted to talk to him. He would visit the chateau through an underground passage connecting it to his own residence at Amboise, and they would spend hours in conversation about art, science, philosophy, and the nature of things. The king called him, according to Benvenuto Cellini, the greatest genius who had ever lived. It is not recorded what Leonardo called the king. Leonardo's right hand had been partially paralyzed, probably by a stroke, and he could no longer paint. He continued to draw with his left hand, continued to work on engineering projects and hydraulic studies, and continued filling notebooks. He died on May 2, 1519. The story that he died in Francis I's arms, which Vasari tells and which has been reproduced in paintings ever since, is probably legendary. Records suggest the king was elsewhere that day. But the story persists because it captures something true about the relationship. A king who valued conversation with a genius more than any painting he could have commissioned. Leonardo was buried in the chapel of Saint Florentin at the Château d'Amboise. His remains were moved during the religious wars of the 16th century, and their current location is uncertain. What survives is the notebooks, the paintings, and the permanent, unresolvable question of what it means that one human being, in one lifetime, could have seen so much and written it all down in mirror script, in notebooks he apparently never intended to publish, for an audience he perhaps never expected to exist.